Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Candace. I work in the education department. It's my second season here at Lakeside. I'm filling in for John Mann this morning. I want everyone to know this is his second day being away sick, and if you know John, you know that this is a very, very rare event, but he should be back tomorrow, and we all wish him well. Our speaker this morning is Chris Allen. We're fortunate that Chris is joining us today for two sessions in the Lakeside Gardening Experience. Chris's session this afternoon at 3:30 is a tree walk, and if you'd like to go on that, meeting at 3:30 at the Hotel Lakeside on the Maple Street patio side. Chris is president of Alum and Arbor Tree Preservation. He's a second-generation visionary arborist dedicated to fostering the healthier urban forest. His leadership and expertise have earned the company a reputation for excellence and exceptional safety standards, while his unwavering dedication to environmental stewardship drives innovation solutions for tree preservation. For this session, Chris will explain how to select the perfect species for your landscape and discuss basic and advanced tree care techniques tailored specifically for our region. So please silence your cell phones and help me welcome Chris.
Well, thanks for having me today. I really appreciate being here. I've been up to Lakeside a few times. We have a few clients up here that we've taken care of some trees, but I've never actually spent the night and spent time up here. So I got a chance to walk around yesterday, enjoy the nice sunset, and I noticed everybody's putting their chairs out, and I joined that, and it was beautiful. So thank you for having me. I'm from Columbus, specifically Hilliard, kind of the west side of the Columbus area. So we do a lot of work on residential tree care down in the central Ohio, Columbus area mostly. So today we're going to talk about how to select trees all the way to taking care of trees. This presentation came from a book that I wrote, 40 Years, 40 Trees. I dedicated it to my dad in 2017. He was diagnosed with PSP. It was kind of like a best way to explain kind of like a Lou Gehrig's disease. He slowly just lost function, and he wound up passing away in 2022. But he was my mentor. He taught me pretty much everything I know. I'm a second-generation arborist, so I grew up in the tree world. I think he had me in a saddle when I was 5 years old, and it's kind of everything I know and love and enjoy. So we'll kind of get started, and I'll hopefully go along through the journey. So when we think about a tree, what do you think a tree is? Like, what comes to your mind when we say a tree? A woody stem? Shade, yeah. Typically, everybody says shade, paper. Those are the typically two quick answers I get. But if you think about it, a tree is one of the largest living organisms, in the world, right? And so, also, trees provide a lot of benefits for us. They're basically the Earth's filters. They take in carbon dioxide, release the oxygen, they clean the air, and a lot of times, I kind of wonder, like, what would it be without trees, right? Like, could we even live without trees? Maybe nowadays we can because there's so much technology, they'll come up with some filter. But, trees provide a lot for us. And when we think about trees, a lot of times when we think about just what we see, right? We think about the leaves, the fruit, the branches. But the one things that we don't think about, are kind of the most important things, are the roots, right? The roots underneath the ground is what anchors the tree. It's also what provides the nutrients, the water, and keeps the trees alive. And then the vascular system. Trees have vascular systems just like us. So they have uptake of nutrients and water, and without that vascular system, the trees don't survive. So a lot of times, when we're diagnosing problems and we're looking at trees, a lot of times people just gravitate right to the canopy and the leaves. But it really, like, especially in Lakeside here is a great example. You have a lot of large trees in really small spaces with, foundations of houses, sidewalks, or driveways. Those roots have found ways to survive. They probably extend way beyond that canopy of the tree. Actually, there was research done in Chicago that actually showed that on average, roots extend 2.5 times the diameter of the canopy. So if you look at some of these trees, like we're going to a tree walk this afternoon, there's a couple really nice, huge, humongous oaks, right? Those canopies are probably every bit of 60 feet wide. Those roots are probably extending 120, 180 feet. Now, when they get that far, they're thread-like roots, but that is how far a root can go. So when you're digging a hole in your yard, that may not be your tree root. That actually may be your neighbor even a few doors down. But they need that to survive, and that's really important. That's something to think about when you think about caring for your trees, because a lot of times, a lot of problems with trees come from the ground, come from the roots, and actually come from us, right? We're digging the pipes, we're digging the irrigation, we're digging things up, and we're actually severing the roots that the tree can't survive. So when we get into like selecting the tree, so we'll start with selecting our tree. Three main things to think about. The first one is the tree requirements. What does a tree require? Does it live in a wet area? Buckeyes are typically found along the creek. They like moist areas. Sycamores are typically found along, wet areas. Red maples, a common name for a red maple is a swamp maple. It likes to be wet, but we plant them in like really dry areas, and they look chlorotic, and they kind of don't look that great. So the first thing to kind of think about is just what does a tree require? What kind of tree will fit in that area? Is it shade? Is it sun? Japanese maples will tolerate sun, but right now, especially with our hot summer, there's going to be crispy if they're in full sun. If they're protected in shade, they might look a lot beautiful. So you take those same trees and put them in two different areas, you'll get different results. The second thing to think about is tree characteristics. How is the tree going to grow? Is it narrow, upright? Like if I walk down like Sycamore or Maple Street, and like some of those trees are nice, big, and wide over top of the houses. But then also some of those trees, if you plant one there, you may need a more upright tree that can kind of stay between the road and the house, right? You don't want it to get really wide and get into the cars and have to be pruning it and things like that. So just kind of thinking also characteristics is also color. Flower colors. There's millions of different crab apples. Literally, I think there's millions of different cultivars of crab apples. But like, what kind of color do you want? Do you want fruit? Sweet gums provide fruit, not the fruit we like, right? A lot of times it's the fruit we're picking up, it's all the bad fruit, But then also there is a hybrid sweet gum that is fruitless. So if you like a sweet gum tree, but you don't want the fruit, there's also some cultivars that could provide you what you want. The third thing is the purpose. Why are you planting the tree? Are you planting it for screen? Are you planting it for shade? Are you planting it just for the heck of it? But what is the purpose of planting it? So I have this just to show there's always a purpose. So sometimes it's just to annoy the neighbor, or sometimes it's for your neighbor. But there's always a purpose when you're planting. And I'm a tree lover, so if there's just you're planting a tree to plant a tree, I'm totally okay with that too. But when we think about planting trees, and we think about where we drive down the road and we look at trees, and you can do that here in Lakeside as well. You see trees like this one on the left. This is a big oak tree with the wires going right through it. Utility company has V-shaped it out and cleared it. Utility companies get really bad names for trees, right? The tree industry and the utility companies don't like each other. But at the end of the day, they'll be the first ones to say they're not pruning trees to make trees look beautiful. They're pruning trees to keep the electric on because they get fined and they get yelled at if you lose your electric. So we can help them by planting the right trees in the right spot. In this left picture, maybe that we can still get a nice tree that gets 20 feet, gives you some shade, but doesn't get up into the wires and has to be topped or V-shaped out, and then eventually will have to be removed or become a hazard. The one on the right, this is a silver maple. Not a bad spot for a tree, except for you're at an intersection, you have wires, and if you think of how big that tree wants to get, a silver maple wants to be 60, 70 feet tall and 30, 40, sometimes 50 feet wide. So think about what that tree develops into. That could be a huge tree right there, and that's just going to cause problems, and you can see where it's constantly being cut back. Maybe a smaller tree that's in that 20, 30 foot range would be better. Maybe it provides screen, depending on what the purpose is there, that you want lower branching and a smaller tree, or if you want shade, a more upright tree that won't get wide enough to be in the wires. So kind of thinking through what that tree is going to look like long term. Because that's one thing that we always forget about. We want it now. I mean, we're a culture of now, right? And we want that tree, we want that shade, we want that prettiness. But sometimes you have to think about what that tree is going to look like 20, 30 years down the road. And as that tree develops, as that tree grows, that's what keeps me in business. So, so just thinking about the right tree. Also thinking about the hardiness. So the hardiness zone, we are 5, I think, yeah, up here is the same as Columbus. So we're 5B, or 5A, or sorry, 6A. And so what that means is certain trees grow here, we don't grow other places, or vice versa. I went on a trip to Maryland with my wife one time, and she loved crepe myrtles. And the whole trip, all I heard was, we need those crepe myrtles. I want that in the backyard. I want this. So I finally was like, they don't grow here. They don't grow here. But she really wanted it. Of course, every husband likes to please their wife, right? So definitely. So I actually called my nursery buddy up and was like, all right, I need a crepe myrtle that grows in Ohio. And so he gave me a couple cultivars. He said, good luck. And I planted them. And of course, I had one cultivar that would grow in Columbus, but it was protected on the east side of the house, so it was protected by the west wind, and it would still die down every year in the wintertime. But it would come up, so it was basically acting as a perennial. She hated it because it never got big and never got flowers. But a good story, because there's a lot of times I come out to properties and people get these plants and they don't grow around here. They don't do well around here. So thinking about, what is the hardiness zone and where are they, suited for best. So this is a great example. You guys won't have to worry about this probably much in Lakeside, but this is what I have to deal with a lot in Columbus and the suburbs. We build all these houses, we skim all the soil away, and then the roads aren't even built, so our hope is actually that road is actually where the road's going to be, and it's not shifted, and that's somebody's front yard. But a lot of times what you see is I get to come out after the tree's already planted, the sod's out, everything looks pretty and beautiful, but again, we don't know what's underground, right? And underground is concrete. It's hard, compacted soil that we drove on nonstop, compacted the soil, compacted the water and the air pores, right? And then the roots can't grow. And the tree struggles and it just sits there. I live in northwest Columbus, a lot of farm fields and a lot of new subdivisions. And this is the trend, is that you dig a hole there, and I could fill that hole with water, and it will sit for a week. Like we're not talking hours, we're talking like a week of the water just sitting there because it's so compacted. There's no way a tree's going to grow there. And so like without doing a lot more work of fracturing the soils and aerating and trying to provide a good place for that to grow, that tree's just going to sit there eventually till it dies. And this is the thing that we don't see a lot, right? We don't see this when we buy that house, or we don't see this when we're building the house. We're thinking of building the house, not the landscape. So just something to think about. Typically, like I would say here is probably a very nice soil, just because it's been around for a while. You don't have a lot of the construction, traffic, things like that. I know there's pockets in Columbus the same way. Your more mature areas have a little bit better soil because it's been there. You have the microorganisms, you have the worms, you have things breaking the organic matter down. And that's all nutrients and energy for the tree. So when we think about, we've kind of thought about what we wanted with the tree, and we found that perfect tree that we want to plant. And then we want to start planting that tree. The biggest thing is that when you walk around, look at the base of the trees. Especially when you go out to, is it Behringer Park? Is that how you say it? Behringer Park. A lot of those native trees, if you look at the base, the root flares are at ground level, right? They're not totem poles, they're not telephone poles. They actually have a really beautiful flare. And that, when you walk in the woods, the same thing happens. A lot of oaks that flare where at ground level could be twice the actual diameter as the trunk of the tree. And that is natural for the tree, the flare out like that. That's what we call the root flare. But if you look in the landscape and look at trees that are planted, do they have that same flare? And so what happens is a lot of times, and this is, hopefully there's not too many nursery people in here because this is where I get in trouble. But a lot of times in the nursery, we're planting trees, we're trying to grow them fast, we're trying to get them out, and we get a root ball that flare might be buried a couple inches deep. Sometimes I've had a 2-inch beech tree 6 to 8 inches deep in only like a 12-inch root ball, right? So I only have 4 inches of soil or 4 inches of roots there, right? So off the bat too, that tree is not going to survive. So when we think about it, we want to make sure that we remove any soil. We want to have that root flare at ground level, right? We don't want that buried deep in the ground. Sometimes we bury deep in the ground, people think that's better because the tree is stabilized, it doesn't fall over. But realistically, you want that root flare right at ground level. Yep, so there are some trees that are grafted, and that's in the nursery, it kind of looks like a root flare. That should actually be a couple inches above the root ball typically. The other thing is I'm a proponent, I'll say it, I hate container trees. I hate container trees. I rarely see a good container tree come out of the nursery. And this is the reason why. They sit in the nursery, the roots get kind of circular, they grow in that container, especially if you get a container tree that's been there for a while. When you plant it, those roots don't just say, oh, I can grow out and I can wiggle around and I can go straight. They're stuck in that circle, and they're just getting larger. So you can see the two pictures on the right, the one at the upper one, this was removed from a planted tree that was in the ground. And you can tell it was a container tree by the way the roots are growing around. So structurally, in my opinion, unless it's done good, container trees are never going to be a great structurally stable tree. Now, where container trees can be beneficial is smaller ornamental trees where they aren't in the root ball that long. And when you plant it, you're breaking the roots. There's actually been some research done where they actually go around and they take a shovel and they actually cut an inch off of that root ball and cut the whole edge of the roots off. And you say, wow, that's a lot of roots. But what happens is it allows the roots to go out instead of being in a circle. Just like your annuals or things like that, you kind of massage the root balls typically when you're planting. You want to do the same thing with the tree. A good nursery on the container aspect will slowly grow that out, right? You might start with like a whip and then grow into a bigger container and a bigger container, so it allows it to grow out. But even those, we still see some circular roots. So when you're planting a container tree, just be careful. And there's a little bit more prep you want to do to make that successful. Sorry, that was my rant on containers. The other thing to think about is when we get into volcanoes or volcano mulching, right? And I haven't seen a lot of that around here, which is good. I see that street trees all over the place back in Central Ohio. And what we do is we mulch, we add more mulch, we add more mulch, we just add more mulch, right? And then we just get this really big volcano. It doesn't explode. What happens is the mulch breaks down, right? And then that's great organic matter. And the roots grow in there. And then what happens is they cause girdling roots. Very common on maple trees, lindens, zelkovas. I'm trying to think of some of those. Like oaks, typically not too much. Every once in a while you get one or two, but not your more fibrous roots, you have more problems with girdling roots. And on the left, you can see what happens is that root kind of chokes that tree, right? And this is a root that's not causing too much problem right now, but eventually, if left, that root's just slowly diameter is going to get bigger and bigger. And then that's slowly just going to suffocate that tree, and that tree's not going to be able to take the nutrients and the water up. This is a significant issue in suburban America with a lot of our trees. You also think we're planting them in, go back to with the soil, right? We're planting them in hard pan clay soil. The roots want to grow out into that. They can't. We have all this nice organic mulch that we just keep adding on top. It's the only place really for them to grow, and they just kind of circle around there. The way I describe this is take a baby girl and give her a really nice tight necklace, but it's still there, right? It's not choking her. But as she develops and her neck gets bigger, that's eventually going to choke. And it's exactly what happens to the tree, is that root, it doesn't immediately just kill the tree, but over time slowly chokes that tree and kills the tree. Typically, it'll cause that tree to decline just enough that other things will actually kill the tree off, but that's typically the root cause of what was causing the problems. So you can, if you do see this or you have this, something to do is you can take a soil, like a soil knife or a shovel and lightly dig that soil away. But you want to be careful that you're not damaging the trunk of the tree doing that. Sometimes what we do as a company, we take what's called an air compressor with compressed air. We come out with this cool looking thing called an air gun, and we actually just blow the soil and the mulch away. What we like about it is it doesn't damage the tree, it just exposes the roots, and that's kind of what happened with this left picture. So we can see all the fine roots, and then we can cut what needs to be cut without damaging anything else. So that's something that I don't know if like a home air compressor would work. A lot of our air that we're shooting is probably like Mach 1, 2 speed, so it's a really high, like it'll actually just cuts right through that clay soil and stuff like that. All right, so I put this picture because this is a happy tree. So we've planted our tree. The tree's happy. Remember, green side up. But if you look, that root flare, again, is at the base, right? It's at ground level. It's not planted high. It's not planted low. If you're going to air on anything, air high, right? I would air a couple inches high than being too low. I always tell people that is I'd rather see it an inch or two higher. It'll typically settle, and if it doesn't, a lot of times in that root ball, there's already a couple inches of that excess dirt, and your root flare is probably already at the base. So once you plant, immediately after planting, I'm not a big fertilizer fan. Most of our fertilizers are salt-based. Salt-based will burn the roots, like the root hairs of the tree. I don't mind fertilizer a year later. Typically, I wait a year before we fertilize, but that initial fertilizer we typically don't do. There is some fertilizer you can do. There's some that you throw in the hole when you plant. There is some that you can do right after care, but generally 95% of the fertilizers you get are going to be a high salt-based fertilizer, which I don't feel is great and helps the tree get established right away. We don't want to prune too much because if you think about a tree, right, the leaves produce the nutrients, right? The leaves are the food of the trees. So if you prune a bunch, you're taking all the food out of the tree, and the tree can't have the resources to grow, to get established. That immediate period of planting, that's a high stress period for a tree because most of its roots are cut from the nursery. You know, it's being planted, it's in a new spot, it needs as much resources as possible to grow. So the only thing we want to do is dead, diseased branches, broken branches, and wait a year to prune that tree. Let it get established before you prune it too much. I'm not a fan of staking. I think staking, research has shown that it does cause a weaker root system. Now, if you're out here in the park against the lake, you're probably going to have to stake because I have to only imagine the wind that comes off the lake. And for success, you'll probably need to stake that tree. Maybe if you're up the hill or back in the back and it's not as windy, I wouldn't stake it unless you need to stake it. And water. I've seen maybe, I could probably count on one hand of how many people killed a tree by overwatering. I don't have enough, I don't know if we have enough hands and feet in this room to count how many people killed a tree with not watering enough. So water a lot, and it's more not frequent every day, just like 2 minutes, but put a hose on the base of the tree and let it trickle for an hour. So typically what I do is a leaky faucet, just enough to kind of dribble out and just set it on the thing and walk away. Be careful. This is where your wives get mad at you because my wife's got mad at me. I forget about it. I walk out. I forget about it, go to work. My wife calls me in the morning and says, "Our yard's flooded." So I said, "Hey, the tree got plenty of water." She doesn't like that. So, but you want a really good deep soaking. You don't want just to get the top of it. Get a really good deep soaking. Doing that once, twice a week is better than just every day just for 30 seconds. Now, where that's different is if you do have a container tree, a lot of that soil and that container dries out very quickly, and you may need to water that a little bit more to keep that wet. So kind of we got our tree planted, and then we think about pruning our trees. And this is what we do quite a bit on large mature trees is pruning. And we want to prevent this. This is actually a bathroom. I had to stand in a leg on the toilet and a leg on the sink when we were trying to cut that tree out of the bathroom. So you guys have a lot of mature trees here, right? The last thing you want to do is get that phone call from the neighbor or somebody saying, hey, your tree fell on your house or it fell in your house. And I would love a tree I would love one of these oaks and have my house underneath it. Like, you have a very magnificent tree, good structure. I'm not worried with a tree over a house. I think as long as it's taken care of. And so we're going to talk a little bit about pruning and how we can make sure trees are successful long term. So when should you prune? And this really goes for anything. This goes for shrubs. Depending on when you prune might depend on how much fruit you get or how much flowers that tree produces. So many times I go out to clients and they're like, I think my plant's dying and never flowered this year. But what they did is they cut all the flower blooms off or the buds off. The tree or the shrub is perfectly healthy. They just pruned it at the wrong time. Trees that flower on current season wood should be pruned during the dormant season or just before that growth in the springtime, right? But trees that flower on last season should be pruned just after bloom. So we have a client that has a whole yard of rhododendrons, and every year we prune it the first week of June. It varies a little bit the last week of May to the second week of June, but that's it. It's right after the rhododendrons are full bloom. Then we go in and we prune them back. And then next year they're full of blooms. If we went and pruned those rhododendrons in the fall or the winter time, those rhododendrons aren't going to be blooming as vibrant, and you're only going to have certain amount of blooms on those because you cut all the buds off. The same thing, like if you think about apple trees. Apple trees typically are on the newer growth, right? So you want to prune that late winter, early spring to produce that growth, to produce maybe that production of fruit. So thinking through when you prune is really important. A really important thing to do too is thinking about a couple of things of oak trees. How many people are familiar with oak wilt? Okay. So oak wilt is a vascular disease that is killing oak trees and will totally annihilate a large oak that's out here in the park like that. It is spread by a bug, but it's actually very active in April through the end of summer. So if you go and prune an oak tree right now in the summertime, you're opening those wounds up for oak wilt if you're in an infested area or close to an infested area. So you want to be very careful of when you prune oaks. We only prune oaks October through March, unless it's like a storm damage situation where we have to, or we've had situations where we have to because they're building a house, and then in that case we actually spray paint the cuts to close those over so it doesn't attract the beetles for the oak wilt disease. And if you get oak wilt, once you have it, you really can't get rid of it. The tree's pretty much gone. I don't know many, maybe, again, on one hand, of a tree that might have had oak wilt that still survived. Basically, once you have a tree that has oak wilt, the best thing is to protect all the other ones around it. So just something to think about. I do notice there's some nice oaks around here. Spring bleeding. If everybody's pruned a tree in the springtime, and you just get the sap just coming, oozing out of the cuts. Typically, it's on birch trees, maples. So I wouldn't say it's a myth, but the research says that doesn't cause damage to the tree. It does lose sap, but a healthy tree will be fine if you prune it in the springtime, as long as you're properly pruning, not over pruning and taking half of the canopy out and making a bunch of cuts. If you're taking a third or less, that tree should survive no problem. But the myth is if that tree bleeds, it'll kill or it'll die. But the research has shown that it actually won't. So when we're making cuts on the tree, These are bad cuts, by the way. So we want to make good cuts. So I teach every one of my guys that prune trees, when you make a cut on a tree, you are wounding the tree. You are actually making a wound to the tree. Just like ourselves, if you cut yourself, you can heal yourself over. The same thing we think about with a tree. We want the tree to be able to heal that wound. But that wound is always going to be there. It's in the wood of the tree. So the most important part is to make that cut so the tree can heal itself over properly and correctly and quickly. So the picture on the left is a too flush of a cut, right? This actually cut into the cambium, into the living tissue of the tree, and now the tree can't heal itself over, and now you actually see fungal spores there. The little mushrooms, what that tells us is that's decay, and we're now getting decay into the tree. When we get decay into the tree, now we have to think about structure issues long-term down the road. This isn't going to cause an issue today, but in 5-10 years, this could slowly hollow that out and make that branch or make that trunk weak and could cause problems. The cuts on the right, that's a honey locust. So they were originally cutting, a 4-inch, let's say a 3-4 inch branch. And so you make that 3-4 inch cut, that tree only has to heal over a 3-inch circle, right? Now that tree has to heal over a 3-inch wide by 6-foot long wound. There's a lot more resources that are going to go into that tree trying to heal that wound versus growing and things like that. So certain trees are prone to rip cuts. Honey locust, red maples are probably the two biggest candidates. They just have that thin bark. And when you make that cut, if you make it improperly or not fast enough, that weight of that branch will kind of fall, and it'll just rip that bark and that cambium all the way off. It doesn't look good, but it also doesn't help the tree. On the flip side, too, is you have those really stubby cuts. Those stubby cuts, so the tree actually heals itself from the parent branch. So in order to heal that stubby cut, it actually has to grow around, all the way up and around that branch. Has anybody ever walked in the woods and looked at some big oak trees deep in the woods, never been pruned, and you see these big kind of like stubs on the oak trees? That's probably a dead branch that broke. And over time, the tree just kind of slowly healed around it, and now you have these big kind of nubs on the trunk of the tree. The same thing has to happen here. I've never really seen that happen on a honey locust. Typically, the honey locust will decay, or before that would actually heal itself over. So when we think about making proper cuts, two things to think about. There's two terminologies: a branch bark ridge and a branch bark collar. And when you look at a tree branch, you'll see this like almost where the branch comes to the trunk, this collar. It goes all the way around the branch, but it almost looks like it's swollen around the base of the branch. And that's a branch bark collar. And that's where the tree heals. That's the vascular system that will heal and grow over that wound. The last thing you want to do is cut into that collar. So your cut should be right outside the collar of the tree. Now the problem is some trees, all trees are different, right? Just like people, you have a spruce or a pine tree, you really can't see the collar. It is almost a flush cut. A walnut tree sometimes could be a couple inches. That collar is out. So it looks a little stubbier. Like a walnut cut is actually probably a little stubbier than a maple cut. So you really have to find where those collars are. And on a very new tree, sometimes it's hard to see those two. They don't exist. So these more exist on your larger branches or more mature trees. On a brand new planted tree, it's hard to find. The other thing to think about is the branch bark ridge. And this is just where the bark just kind of ridges up between the tree and the branch. This is a birch tree, very easy to see because it's discolored. You get that black color versus the white bark, so it really stands out. But not all trees are that easy. But even on this one, there's typically some type of ridge there. And you want to make sure you don't cut into that. The textbook says 45-degree angle, or I'm sorry, 90 degree, 45 from the ridge. I don't think that's true in all cases, but I think the key is to not cut into it, and that will give you a good start of where that collar is if you can't find that collar. So really important to help heal the tree over and make the proper cuts. A way to not make those rip cuts is a 3-cut method. I teach this to every single one of my employees when they're pruning, and that is you make a little undercut, not much, just enough to sever that cambium and that growing tissue. Your second cut is just a little bit further out, so when you make that second cut through, it pops or breaks, and that branch falls, and then you're left with a stub, and your third cut is just flushing that stub off. And that prevents that tear. Now the downside with this is if you're using a chainsaw, that undercut, if you go too deep and you have a big branch, you might get some weight that pinches your saw. So you got to remember that you only need to go like an inch, if that. All you're doing is severing the cambium and the growing tissue, and that's it. Everything else is on that second cut and that third cut to make that finish. I didn't see too many of these, but this is bad. Topping's no good. And I put this in, people always say, I want my trees small, I want to just top my trees. We do not top trees. The good arborists should not top your trees. And why is because this is what happens. On the right, this is a silver maple that actually was topped, and it did survive, and it shoots out all these suckers, right? So the right side is a sucker. Well, that's eventually going to break, fall, or if you put a climber in that to climb it the next time, that's going to rip and break. I've heard and know of climbers where they've threw their like rope in the tree, started climbing up, and their weight just ripped, because if you look, that's a guy's hand, and you can see the thickness of that sound wall is not thicker than a finger width, right? So that's not structurally sound. And the more that grows and gets weight, that's where you get more branches falling. You get a higher chance of failure down the road. So topping actually will cause more problems long term. It's simply costlier because the next time you have to prune, it's going to cost a lot more money because we can't prune it the same way, and we have to take a lot more safety precautions. And most of the time, certain species won't recover. Like a beech tree won't, if you top a beech tree, it's going to die. Silver maples will grow out of it typically, but certain species just won't recover from like a topping done. So one other pruning that I really love, and I think this is not done enough, is structural pruning. And this is what you can do now on younger trees. And this is what actually helps trees in the future, right? So this is what we think about is like promoting good structure long term. So on the left is a pear tree. It's the same tree both sides, but you can see the two limbs making two cuts, and we promote a better center leader on that tree. Now the benefit would have been is if we did this 3, 4, 5 years ago and made those cuts, we could have then made some more cuts in the canopy to actually promote some better structure. Besides pears being invasive and you can't plant them, they can actually be a decent structural tree, but you got to prune them when they plant them, right? And then if you made a cut or two on that pear tree every year, you would have a really nice structural sound tree that wouldn't break. But what happens is we plant them, a lot of times they come in the nursery already bad structure because what they do is they top them in the nursery so they have this big poofy crown so they look good to the consumer, like, oh, that's a nice thick green canopy. But what they don't look at is the structure where basically at that point where they topped it, you have 5 branches coming from the same point. And then every storm, you have a branch falling. Every storm I have a pear tree or a silver maple. It's one of the two. And most of the time, it's the pears because of how their structure is. But with structural pruning, what you're doing is making smaller cuts, and you're only making 1 or 2 cuts a year. And what you want to do is promote a nice central leader or a dominant leader. You want to look at your spacing of your scaffold branches, right? And then you're looking at, what does that look like, and thinking about what that looks like in the future. We don't throw kids in the closet, come back 10 years and say, man, I hope they turned out okay, right? But we do that every day with trees. We plant them, we turn our back, we forget about them, and then we become a problem, then we're getting called. And then you're spending more money, too, because making a cut or two a year is way cheaper than cabling and brace routing and doing all kind, or taking it off the house and stuff like that. And a lot of the mature trees already have that structure now, developed. Where the structural pruning, you can develop the structure of that tree. You can make that a sound tree and not have any problems with it. So this is one that I really recommend. Don't wait till it gets too big, too late. Make some smaller cuts, even cuts that you can do. You don't have to hire somebody to do it, and just try to promote some nice even branch structures and a nice central leader. I would look at this right here, right? You have, like this eventually will be a problem. So you need to select a central leader. See how you have two codominant, yeah, you have two leaders here, one this one and one this one. So one of those needs to become a central leader. And this is where the art comes in. You know, either one is probably relevant. So if we're going to choose this one, I might just suppress, make a little cut here, so this doesn't kind of grow and compete. And I'm basically saying, hey, you one on the left, grow and be big and be my central leader, and I just take a little suppression cut on the one on the right. I would also look at it, could I get rid of one of these branches here on these secondaries? So then that way, I kind of thin that out. Because like right now, actually, this looks a little thick compared to this side. And I think I could get a branch out there that would give it better structure. All right, so do it yourself or hire someone. I always throw this in here. People die pruning trees. Like it is a fact. It's a very dangerous. We're one of the most dangerous occupations. We climb on a half-inch line 80 feet up in the air in a tree, right? But a lot of times we can do it very safely. But where I see people have problems, when I read the obituaries, I get a weekly thing through our association of people that died, and it's weekly, which is really sad. But a lot of times it's not the professionals. And you hear that it's a guy that was on top of a ladder that was on top of the bucket and on a skid steer, and it slipped off that, and he fell, and you know, so like, think about these 4 questions before you go to prune your tree. What kind of tree is it, right? Because you need to know what kind of tree it is to know what it's supposed to look like, right? Why do you want to prune the tree? And get out of the house is an okay reason, but just don't take it out on the tree. But you know, what is the reason you're going to prune that tree? And then how are you going to prune the tree? Right, and this is the most important part. How are you going to do that? How are you safely, effectively prune that tree? And can you do that? Do you have the right tools? So just be careful. Definitely in the small trees, go for it. As the trees get bigger, be careful being on your roof, leaning over, trying to make that cut, and be safe. So that's the presentation for taking care of the trees, but I do have a couple that I want to share with you that I feel are underused in our area. Some of my favorites, and these are in my book. So I wanted to go through these, my top 10. First one technically is not a tree, but it is definitely one of my favorites, and this is a bottlebrush buckeye. So if you want screening, this is a great screen. This is actually, this picture doesn't do justice. This is 12 feet tall, and this is like 15 feet wide. One bush over time grew this. This is in my dad's front yard. As a kid, I used to have forts inside these things and crawl through these. It was the coolest thing. But it definitely provides a nice screen. Now, in the wintertime, they do drop their leaves, so it doesn't give that winter all year round screen. Beautiful white flowers, does have buckeyes. I can't tell you how many buckeye necklaces I made from this bush. So on average, 8 to 12 tall, 8 to 15 wide, but just a really magnificent, shrub. And it flowers midsummer, so it's something that doesn't, like, all your flowers are in the springtime, and it's one of those things that flower more midsummer that nothing else is really flowering. This is another one that is very uncommon. It's actually becoming more readily available, though, in the nursery, and this is a very good tree. It's called a 7 sunflower. Do what? You have one? Okay. Okay. So if you're familiar with a eucalyptus tree, bark like a eucalyptus, right? So you get that kind of flaking off bark, that white bark, but now this won't get anywhere near the size of a eucalyptus tree, but it gives you that characteristic. So it has a really neat bark characteristic. Flowers late summer, fall. So again, it's a flower at a different time, right? Like I have mine at home is just now like starting to get ready to flower, right? So I'm going to get August flowers versus spring flowers. So again, just a different, texture in the landscape. Very insect resistant. Disease resistant, it does get cankers and it does get some fungal disease, so you got to be careful. I've never really sprayed mine, but every once in a while I will lose a branch and I just have to cut it out. It can be multi-trunk. or it could be a single trunk. I like the multi-trunk form, but that's a personal preference. And the same thing, 10 to 20, 10 to 15 wide. Mine at home are 8 years old, and they're probably gutter height, so every bit of that, 12 foot tall. So fairly fast growing, but it's not growing as fast as a weed, definitely. But you definitely get some good height very quickly. Everyone's my favorite. This one's a paperbark maple. You don't get flowers, but this is one of my first favorite trees. Cinnamony, flaky bark, really deep red fall color, very, very, very slow growing, right? Perfect for the spot that you don't want to outgrow anything, right? It's not a fast growing tree. The one in my yard right now, I planted 8 years, and it might have put on 1.5 feet, 2 foot of growth. It just doesn't grow super fast. These, you can get multi-trunk as well, or single trunk. I prefer the single trunk tree form. I like the low branching structure. But just really, really nice disease, insect-resistant tree too. You plant this, you turn your back and you walk away. You rarely have to do anything with these. Rarely do I see paperbark maples having issues or problems. Okay. This is one I love, but I'm probably this might be my last presentation with it. I love the purple flowers, pink flowers. So it's a purple robe locust. So it's a black locust. And black locusts aren't really great trees. They typically are fence line trees. They get decay and stuff like that. But I'm seeing more and more problems with these. I don't see these reaching that 20, 30 foot tall. I don't see them getting 15 to 30. They seem to grow fine until they get to that 15-foot-ish range, 20-foot range. I feel like they start to die out. I've started to see a little bit more issues with these, but I do still love them. They need a little bit more care, I think, in that long term. But just a different, again, it's just a different species of tree. Again, just different color, different texture. Regal Prince Oak, this is actually our shop in Hilliard. And we actually planted these. You see you have the drive coming through in the parking lot. That is a 3.5, 4 foot width there. And they are a very nice upright tree. It is an oak, so it does have acorns. But it's a smaller acorn, but a very, very tight shaped tree. This picture's probably from 2012 or 2014. 10 years later, they're probably almost twice the height, but maybe only a foot the width. So very nice, tight. I really like these trees. Another tree you can plant, turn your back, and walk away from. Never had any issues with these trees. I like these a lot better than just your traditional English oaks. Your upright English oaks, to me, just get messy, and then they get really floppy in the storms, or especially up here when you get a lot of snow. Branches kind of flop out, and then you got to prune those. This is a little bit more tighter and more sturdy branches that you don't get as much flopping going on there. A good evergreen, New Canensis Falls Cypress. So this is my replacement for the hemlocks. I don't know about up here, but everybody tries to plant hemlocks in Columbus. It's hard clay soil. It's 7.2, 7.5 pH. And they really strive, like if you go down to Hocking Hills, you get 60-foot tall hemlocks there, but it's a sandstone is the base soil. And so your pH is like closer to your mid-6s than your limestone soil that's hard clay that's in your 7.5s. So hemlocks don't do really great where I'm from, and this is my replacement for them. You get a little droopy, you get a little weepy effect, a really nice evergreen, and this will grow sun and shade. In the shade, it's going to be a little bit less thick though. Full sun, you're going to have a super thick, dense, you aren't going to see through. You can see here, these are kind of part shade. So on the left side, it's a little bit, you can kind of see a couple holes through there where it's just, not as thick. But a great evergreen. You can also get these in a very upright, narrow form. This form is actually called densiforma, which is a little bit thicker. But there's also the traditional form, which is like just a corner of a house, very straight and a little weepy, but really narrow as well. I mean, we're in the Buckeye State, so we have to have another Buckeye. You can't just go with one. But the dwarf red Buckeye is another favorite. This is one I don't see a lot in the landscape. Beautiful tree, Father's Day, full bloom, right? We always have Father's Day picnics, and I feel like I always get, or no, sorry, not Father's, Mother's Day. So Mother's Day, we always have like to get together, and you always have full bloom, that deep red. Can be multi-trunk, can be single trunk, more of a roundish oval form. So can get a little bit thicker. So if you're planting this at like a corner of a house, you don't want to plant it super close if the podium's a house. Give it room to fill in and to grow because it will get a nice round canopy. Having problems finding these in the nursery more and more. So a good replacement is a ruby red horse chestnut. And just not as red of flowers, it's more of a pink flower, but really similar. The difference is your horse chestnut, your buds are sticky. If you touch the edge of the buds, they're sticky, where the Buckeyes aren't, they're dry. That's the best way to tell the difference between the two. But that's another good replacement for that. Blue spruces, right? They're all dying. They have so many issues, but everybody wants blue color in their landscape. So a great replacement is a concolor fir. I actually planted 4 or 5 of these in my landscape. The nice thing is they're soft needles, right? So firs are soft, more of that rubbery needle than that really like poke you needle. They can get 50, 70 foot tall, typically in our landscapes. They are a slower growing evergreen, so it takes a long, long, long time for them to get that tall. But it will give you that bluish needle color, right? And they're different, just like a blue spruce. Some are like really blue, some are more green with just like a blue tinge. The concolor firs will have a very similar feel. It depends on the genetics where you get them from, of how blue they're gonna be or not. I have 5 in my yard, and 2 are really blue. One, I question if it is, and I kept looking, it is, but it's more green. So you get variations of that blue as well. So if you're one of those people that like all your things to match, be very careful when you're picking those out, because sometimes they may be a little off. So here is the secret. I could have saved a lot of time, but I wanted to capture you guys for an hour. But plant the right tree in the right place. Like that is the secret truth serum right there. If you plant the right tree in the right place, you're going to save a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of headaches, right? Making sure you have the right tree that's going to grow in your area, that's going to grow in that spot. You don't have to spend a lot of money on somebody like me to prune it constantly away from the house or do things. That's the most important thing, is getting that right tree in the right spot. And I know sometimes we're stuck with what we have. You love the house and you're stuck with this tree that's too close, and we can manage that. But if you're planting, that's the key. So this is my information. I'd love to help you guys out. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. But with that, I'll take any questions. I think she's gonna come around with the microphone.
Hello again. My question is about the trees that were cut wrong, where the bark was ripped off the. Is there any way of saving that? I've seen them painted. I don't know what people are doing, but can that tree be saved?
So it can be saved, but you can't really do anything to fix that wound. That wound is done, and that wound is there, and it's just going to take time for that tree to heal itself. Painting is going to be aesthetic value, unless it's an oak in the middle of summer. The research has shown painting doesn't help or hinder. So sometimes we'll paint really only if it's like, I had a guy that we had to prune a bunch of trees. He didn't want people, his daughter was getting married, he didn't want people to know that he just pruned his trees, so we had us paint every cut. But that was an aesthetic value. It had nothing to do with the tree. And the same thing with those wounds is the damage is done. You just have to let the tree heal itself over. Got one there and then one here.
Oh, thank you. What is the latest on the ash borer?
So the ash borer in Ohio is pretty much gone. I was actually in Milwaukee last week, and they're still dealing with it up there, and a guy in Colorado is just now getting it. But it's kind of a bell curve. We're on the back side of the bell curve, but ash still is here. We've actually seen, if you don't treat the ash trees consistently, we have seen the ash trees decline. And so the borers are still around enough to treat this. Sorry, I got the fly in my face. The borer is around just enough that it still can kill the tree and infest the tree. So we still do a lot of treatments for ash trees. We typically do the every other year injection and the ash trees. So yes.
Chris, two questions. First is kind of a silly one. If you cut the top of your Christmas tree off, does that prevent the water from being absorbed from the Christmas tree holder when you're going to leave it up for 3 weeks?
No. So the trees will still bring it up. I have to prune my Christmas tree every year because I always get too big of a tree, and then I sometimes have to paint too because I scratch the ceiling. But so no, if you take that and cut that, you still have the needles and you still have that absorbing. The most important part is actually making sure you have a fresh cut that actually the vascular system cells are open and will absorb that water. If you cut the tree and you let it lay before you put it up and put it in water for a long time, like if it's like say a day or so, that'll actually, the cells will start to close and kind of prevent some of that uptake.
The second question is a practical one for all of us. How do we advise our arborists when we want to get just the right combination of speckle light to the grass so that it doesn't all grow, doesn't fail to grow? So how do you advise the arborist?
That's a great question because there's been a lot of research to that, and we do a lot of thinning out on the trees and things like that. But to have grass grow underneath trees, especially when you're talking about a full maple, you really want direct sunlight. And so having holes in the canopy where you can get sunlight patches through is great. The best way is to really reduce the canopies between canopies of trees to allow sunlight, or to raise the canopy to get sunlight in. That's the best way to keep your grass super green. Otherwise, thinning, but as soon as you thin the trees, I feel like within a year or two, like the tree laughs and grows back, right? And so it does help, but it's a constant battle with that. Trees and grass don't go along well. So we got one up here.
Thank you. One question about terminology. Structural pruning, is that the same thing as young tree training? That's what I've heard it called in Toledo, or are there differences between those two things?
I'm not familiar. Like structural pruning is kind of more of a arborist terminology.
Okay.
I would say young tree training is similar. Like structural pruning you can do from like a small tree at 2 inches to a tree of maybe like 12 inches. Once the tree gets structure formed, you can't really structural prune. Okay. Same thing with young tree training. So
smaller trees.
Yeah, it's probably very similar.
Okay. And then my other question is, I live on a major thoroughfare with no curbs, and so my front yard gets inundated with salt in the, when it all melts off. But I'm also a major intersection for a lot of utility lines. So is there a tree you would recommend that would have some kind of salt resistance, but a smaller tree that might do well in that situation?
Yeah, that's a good question. Your maples do great in Ohio. I think they're typically salt tolerant. So even if you don't want it, like a sugar maple may get 60 feet tall and maybe get too wide. But I think a small, like a trident maple is actually a really underutilized maple tree, just a very smaller size tree. And so that would be a good option there. And actually, trident maples perform very well. OSU did a street tree study, and they did very well on the street tree. So with pollution, salt, just all that as a street tree, typically not good soils. So a good option there.
My question is,
Good, you're good.
pH of the soil and/or acidic level, does that impact the color of your firs that you just referred to up here and/or blue spruces, like it would say with hydrangeas? Make the more acid, the more blue the flower becomes?
Not that I know of. That's actually a great question. I don't know the answer to. I can't tell you with certainty either way, but my hunch is no, just because I know, like, in my yard I have pH of the soils are pretty similar in that area, right, with between, like, 10, 20 feet away, and I get a lot of different blues. I don't know of any studies, and I've not done any research to really quantify that. So that's a great question that I wish, I guess I don't really have a true answer for you.
Somebody over here? Okay. Skylar?
Yep, we got one
Skylar.
up here.
Two questions, please. So first, what if you put in a tree and then the next year you're like, ooh, I really wish I would have put it someplace else? How can you transplant that tree, or how long before it's like so established you can't do that? And then the picture that you had with the mounds of mulch, back home in Michigan, we have a couple of trees like that. Can you just remove all of that and look and see what you have? Or would you say, oh, take it down a couple of inches every year until you're down to the ground, or just take it all off and see what's happened?
Yeah, great questions. So the first question, remind me what that was real quick. Yes. Okay. Yeah, you can replant that tree a year from now. That if where you get in problems is you plant that tree and then like 5 years later you're like, oh, I want to move that tree, right? And then it's been there. The roots are out. Sometimes what we'll do is we'll actually go in the year before and actually cut the roots. So it stresses a tree out, but it's still not fully out of the ground. And then we'll go in the next year and actually dig that up and then do it that way. So sometimes if it's been a mature tree in the landscape for a while, we could do that. The biggest thing when you're transplanting that tree is trying to keep the roots intact and not ripping the roots or breaking the roots, right? So you have to go around and cut all those roots, get up underneath that, and be able to get that out of the ground. And that's simply where people damage the tree or have problems. Within a year, shouldn't be too much of a problem. So second question, the mulch, that was it. That was it. So second question, the mulch, yes. So I would go in and just take as much off as you can and see what's there. And taking a shovel or a hard rake and just rake all that off. You could even, a lot of times that's layered. So you might have to take the mulch off, cut some roots, take some more off. And you should really be able to find that nice flare. So I would, if you're doing that, I would probably not do that like May, like spring, flush of growth, right? Now through the fall, perfect time. We do all of our growing roots in the fall time before the ground freezes. So we'll start in September and go September, October, November, and do a lot of that root work. So, yeah.
On the east side of Hoover Auditorium are 4 different maples that should mature at around 25 feet. Great for under wires.
I think we had 2 questions, one here and one there. Oh.
When planting trees near a house, do you need to worry about proximity to the house as far as roots potentially affecting foundation, or do they navigate around the foundation?
That's a great question. So so roots can cause a lot of problems to foundations, but typically they're causing problems to foundations that have cracked foundations. So roots are very advantageous as if there's a crack and they find like a thread-like root gets in that crack. As that root expands and it's going to get wider, it's going to do significantly more damage. If you have a very clean foundation, I wouldn't really worry about it. If you're in an older house, I would be more careful of like planting a river birch there that's going to have a very aggressive root system. But typically, most in Ohio, most of our foundation damage is by freeze and thaw. not by roots. I actually was talking to a couple basement guys in our area, and he was even telling me, he's like, yeah, trees get a bad name, but it's a lot of the clay, freeze thaw that's actually causes most of our cracking. But once the cracking's there, the roots can do a lot of damage. So, you're welcome. Oh, back here behind you.
We have a tree here at Lakeside. I don't know what kind it is, but it's a mature tree. And there's so much rock under the soil. I think that's common throughout Lakeside. So now the roots are growing on top of the grass. They're big, big roots. And it's like a trip hazard. So is there anything we can do about that? Like put dirt on top or?
It's very situational, but the short answer is yes, possibly. It depends on, so roots, a tree roots are within the first 12 to 18 inches of the soil is the majority of the roots. They don't have that traditional tap root. It goes way deep down. Like even the big oak trees, they're within that first 18 inches of the soil, but they're going so far out. What we've done is with like those trip hazards is go in and actually take the air spade and spade out like the dirt and cut those roots. If they're far enough away from the trunk of the tree, it's not a problem. What happens is you can't go like, if I'm the tree, you can't go right here and cut that root, otherwise you're gonna cause substantial damage. But like let's say you have a tree that's 20 inches diameter and 10 feet out you have a 4-inch, 6-inch root, making that one cut probably isn't going to damage the tree if the tree's healthy. Now, I would want to assess the tree, look, make sure it's like nice and green and healthy. And what I would also be careful is don't just go in and cut every single root you see. So I have a client that we've done that with where we've actually cut roots every 2 years over like a 6-year span, where we started with the really like trip hazard, big, thick roots and took that out, maybe came back and did 2 more. But what we did is, so we didn't stress the tree out. You can add some dirt. I'd be careful because a lot of people just want to bring like a dump truck and dump a bunch of dirt on it. And then what you're doing is you're adding 6 inches or 4 inches of soil. And then those roots now aren't getting the air, the oxygen, as they're layered with a bunch of soil on top. So adding a lot of soil could definitely cause problems. I've seen people just try to take a bag of soil and throw it on the roots. I feel like that never really works. It's like a temporary fix, but eventually just kind of washes and then the root's still there. Mulch is a good, if you have mulch as a good option, you can definitely mulch it. So hopefully that helped.
You don't like to buy you don't like to buy young trees in plastic containers. What should we buy?
That's a great. I guess a tree's better than no tree, but if you have to, balled and burlap is the best one. So kind of when you have the burlap tree that's coming spaded out of the nursery, typically a better root system on that if you can get that. And it's a lot more prone on the container trees. So if you do get the container trees, you just got to cut a lot of those roots off and make sure they're not circling.
If you buy a container tree, is it good to make some vertical cuts on the roots?
Yeah, you could definitely do that. I used to always do like at least 4, if not more, vertical cuts. I've now turned the shelf and I've just shaved the roots off, and just like shaved off like a 1/2 inch. Like if I have a container like this, right, it's a big container, I might try to shave off that like 1/2 inch of roots and just cut that last layer out. I still wouldn't be afraid to make a vertical cut here or there too. Because think if you're making that vertical cut, you're kind of killing whatever's on the other side of that cut. So it's really doing the same thing. But I've done more of just where I've started shaving them versus making just the cuts. But a cut is better than nothing, for sure.
In a suburb on the north side of Columbus, like one of the ones you've been talking about, built in about the 1990s, there are 2 crabapple trees between the curb and the sidewalk. And there are all kinds of, I think you call them suckers, that are coming up in the grass, within that grass area. Plus they go under the sidewalk and get into the lawn just before the house. And they're everywhere. What do we do with that?
There's a great product called Sucker Stopper.
Suckers?
It comes in a Windex-sized bottle. Like it legitimately, it's like $20, $25. You don't like, and I think I have it in my cabinet still 5 years later. But what you do is you prune the suckers off and you spray it right when you prune it, and it keeps that from resuckering out. Some of these crab apples, I swear, when you prune those suckers, they just giggle and laugh, and then just like throw like 5 more out at you. And so the sucker stopper actually will retard that growth, and it may take a season or two to do that. So if you cut and spray that, next year you might still have some suckers, but not as many. But what I found within like a 2-season cycle, I can get rid of all those. I used to have a crab apple like that. That was like, the base was here, and it was like this thick of just suckers right around it. So that's the only thing. I wouldn't spray Roundup, because Roundup, or something like a herbicide, because that will take up into the tree and could cause problems with the tree. So. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
I'll stick around for a little bit. If you have specific questions, don't hesitate to ask, and be happy to join me this afternoon. It'll be a lot less informal. We'll just be walking, looking at trees, and a lot of these issues that we talked about we'll identify this afternoon too. So, thank you.